Thank you all very much. I'm going to make a few comments first about my work and about how I got to becoming an artist, and then show you some images. My son Sam, he's just turned 17. And when he was a little boy, he had a children's book about 3 bears that encountered urban sprawl. And these bears, they go up over our hill near their den one morning. They look down and somebody's built a shopping center overnight. Well, already people are hustling and bustling up and down the sidewalk, and they all look so satisfied. Well, the little bears, they're not sure if they're happy anymore. And somewhere they find people clothes. In the next sequence of pictures, you see these little pint-sized figures moving amongst the legs of all the other passers-by. And the caption reads, well, now that they're like everybody else, are they really happy? Well, no, not really, because underneath their people clothes still beat their very little animal hearts. Well, a big wind comes up and it blows and it blows men's ties out, women's skirts up, blows all the little bears' clothes off, and they see each other for the first time and realize who and what they really are. Wow, they go tearing back across the parking lot, back to a place they could just be themselves. And it wasn't so many years ago as the crow flies that I was getting ready for work. I had a coat and tie on and a briefcase. I start down my walkway and a really big wind comes up. And it blows and it blows. It blows my briefcase right down the street, blows off my coat and tie, and the third gust blows everything else away. And as I'm standing there completely amazed at this unlikely turbulence in my life, the only thing that I can feel under those people clothes is this thudding of an animal heart. And I have all these flashbacks to the times in my life when I imagined maybe giving up my regular life, going off into the distance, maybe into the wilderness, and building a small cabin and living in a more essential way. Well, you know, it was a time of change for me, and so I found myself at the how-to section of the library. I see things like load bearing, R factor, coefficient. I say, well, maybe building a house, even a small cabin, is a whole lot harder than I thought. But luckily for me, as I start back across the library, I happened to stumble on a stack of National Geographics. And maybe the first one I picked up was about the barrios in Rio de Janeiro, in which a whole group of the population, a portion of the population, the disenfranchised, have to go out into the city and pick up the dendritis, the cast off of urban life, take that material somewhere and build them someplace to live. And I said, I know I'm not supposed to like this because these are really poor people, and yet they've done an amazing job with the materials that they had at hand. And in my mind, it constituted a kind of raw aesthetic. Or maybe it was an article about a tribe in the Amazon basin who had to go into the jungle and forage whatever was there in order to build the things that they needed. I said, well, I know these huts don't have any running water or electricity, but they're beautiful, and they fit so well back into the environment from which the material was drawn. Or maybe it was an article about a bird from Africa that had done an amazing engineering feat. Well, I said, I know these birds are not smart enough to do this, but in human terms, this would be considered amazing craftsmanship. It's then I realized that maybe I wasn't a normal builder. Maybe I was more of a hunter and gatherer or some kind of an inspiration builder. And you know, I did get started on that house, and I learned some things while building it that really stood me in good stead in my art life. And maybe the first is the simplest. It's learning to accept what you do. Because if you don't know much about building, you put a window in the morning, I can guarantee by the afternoon you think you've done such a shoddy job, you're jerking the thing right out again. So to give it a good shot, what I decided, even before I began the project, that I was going to do the very best job I could do. At the end of the day, I was going to accept my progress, and the next day I would build on it. The second thing is, if you use non-standard materials like so many sculptors do, you can't always go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy the things you need. And similarly, if you cut down a big tree and decide to use it as the mainstay of your house, how do you know it would work, and who would you ask? Well, I played a game with myself I called giving it my one best shot. And I said, you know, if there's nobody left on earth to ask, what do I think? Do I think it's strong enough? And somewhere along there, I began accepting responsibilities for the kinds of things that I designed and made. The third thing is that working day in and day out in a very unself-conscious way, I began to see what I liked and what I didn't like. I saw how important personal preference is in making those decisions. And over a period of time, I began to develop my own sense of personal aesthetic. And finally, I saw how important need is in getting anything done. I really needed this house. And so I was able to coalesce my best energies and direct my best problem-solving skills. And sometimes when I have a friend who's not doing that well with their work, I'll say, you have to figure out how to knead it. Well, I didn't know it was getting out of hand, but my neighbors did. And they were always coming down to my house and kicking the dirt and scratching their head. And once my friend Brooks brought a relative from another area of the country, and he said, I really like what you're doing here. You're a real artist. Well, maybe for all of you, that characterization would be great, but it just scared me to death, and I felt like the edge of the earth, and I wanted to take it back. And upon reflection, I realized that as a child, I thought being an artist was the best thing you could possibly be. The only trouble was it seemed to come with this tremendous sense of social responsibility. You were supposed to do something great, something that saved people, you know, something amazing. And, you know, it came with that other word, talent. Somehow you were supposed to be talented. Well, I knew what the word art and, you know, and talent had to do with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. I just couldn't figure out what it had to do with me or anything I was doing at my house. So one day, as if by magic, I found myself enrolling in the nearest art department, taking art history courses and sculpture courses. And you know, for me, that minute, that day was the best day of my life, because I didn't know there was anybody else like me. I didn't know there were lots of people that liked handling materials, that liked seeing their ideas get worked out in 3 dimensions. The only trouble was I was kind of an art nerd, and I'd walk around at everybody and I'd say, is this art? Is this art? How come this person gets to paint this board blue and call it art? And I was just about to hold forth when one of the major professors did me a favor. He gets me by the throat, starts choking me to death, and he says, who in the hell cares if it's art or not? Why don't you just go in there and make whatever you want to make? Who's going to know the difference in 20 years anyway? And you know, I needed that permission giving. And I think I learned some things while I was in school that helped towards my continuation as to becoming a working artist. Maybe the first is the importance of a role model, because I didn't know if you had to have a psychiatrist standing by when you made your first artwork, or whether you had to have a family upheaval and get a divorce, or whether you had to be, you know, go to a major city nearby and work as a waiter in order to qualify. And it wasn't until I saw these people who loved making things, who were really intensely interested in their work and seemed happy, that I realized there was going to be some hope for me. The second thing is that it's hard to be a food faddist unless there are other people around who eat beans and rice. And similarly, it's hard to be a working artist unless there are other people around who understand what you're going through. For me, I think my biggest job as a working artist is to maintain a sense of personal equilibrium. And this is particularly hard in our society that gives high marks to culture but ignores individual makers. And it's easy to have an identity crisis at any time in your career in which you walk in your studio and for 1 minute you don't realize who made the work. And it's then you're glad that you have a university art department around, or that you know somebody at a distant location. You call them up and you say, are you still working? And they say, yeah, I am. And somehow you're released and able to go back and do your own work. The third thing is that I began to see there was a big difference between doers and viewers, between people who make things and people who look at them seriously. To my mind, it was 2 different jobs. Museum directors, curators, gallery owners, you know, their job is to decide what object is more inherently interesting than another, or where something fits in the lifeline of art. Hey, that's not my job. I have to be true to my ideas, true to my materials, and sometimes, as in the case we're working here, I didn't know what I was doing when I arrived. So if I have to decide whether something's good or not, or whether it's art historically significant, I would never get going. And finally, I had to deal with that word talent. And I decided, although talent wasn't irrelevant, it just wasn't the issue. I had the right to make what I wanted, when I wanted, however much I wanted. Basically, I could do as much artwork as I could afford. Well, at some shimmering moment, I decided to quit school, go home, build a studio, and get to work. Well, you know, it's one thing to know that you have a right to make something, and it's another thing to know what you're going to make and how you're going to make it. And luckily for me, I went to a lecture at the university by a woman named Marty Zelt, who had been a seamstress in her life before sculpture, and she brought Velcro fasteners or zippers and cloth to her work. And I'm leaving that lecture and I'm saying, I wonder what I already know. I wonder what simple technology, some simple method of joining that I might already be familiar with. And as I'm driving home, along the roadways of North Carolina, you know, maintenance crews are always cutting the sticks down along the road and maintaining the brush. And like Paul being struck off his horse on the way to Damascus, I have an epiphysis. I said, maybe I could use those. Well, it wouldn't be so unusual that a woodsman like myself would see the potential of the saplings along his driveway because they're plentiful, they're renewable. It's just like having a giant warehouse always at your fingertips. And after working with this material for a while, I realized that I had a deeper resonance with it because I had grown up in the woodlands of North Carolina, and we have lots of underbrush, lots of intersecting lines. And as some kids laid in fields and looked at the architectural details of clouds, I found myself looking at the drawing quality of the winter landscape, all those hatch marks, all those natural lines. So when I turned to sculpture, it seemed easy to co-opt the forces of nature and play all that natural drawing style out into these surfaces of these large kind of gestural forms. You know, but before I could get going, I had to figure out what birds and beavers and other natural shelter builders know about sticks. And that is that they have an inherent method of joining. If you drag a stick through the woods, you see what I mean. You start out this way, but before long, it's got this infuriating tendency to tangle. And every stick has a little bit of flexibility. So if you flex it and you pull it through the matrix and let it go, it kind of snaps back and holds itself in place. That's the what. But that's the how, but the what. If you had seen me at the time, you'd have taken pity on me. I could spend about 5 minutes in an art museum before running out with a headache and sweaty palms and go, they've used all the good ideas up. Or, you could look at an art magazine for a short period of time and you'd say, they've exploited every material. And then you hear that in the last census in New York City alone, over 1 million people claim to be visual artists. You say, whoa, there are too many of us. But after wearing this for a while, I realized that I loved to make things. I loved handling the material, and I decided the art world was just going to have to lump it. Before I show you a few images, I'd like to say 2 other things, one about the art world in general and the other about creativity. For me, the art world is not a wall. What it is a loosely knit group of jobs filled with people, good people like you and I, and those people don't tell artists what they have to do. Artists have to decide what they want to do. And artists, there's not one person that hasn't imagined being taken a fiery chariot to a major city where they and their work get what they hope for. The truth is that we all want different things. Some people want to live in a certain city. They want to live and drive a certain kind of car. They want to have a certain number of children. And these real world activities are help you set the priorities of what opportunities you allow yourself to be available to. The second thing is that, I arrive someplace with a pair of clippers and 3 weeks later I have to have a good piece. And so I've had a few reflections on creativity. And the first is that hysteria rides on the shoulder of every creative person. And so if you want to figure out how to move forward fast, you've got to figure out how to channel your hysterical energy. The second thing is that I have different states of being. I have a state of being in which I do my laundry and eat my dinner, another state of being in which is a door behind which all my problem-solving skills lay. And the question is, how do you go over and open that door? Well, if I happen to be home in North Carolina and my friends come over and you can see the cares of the week shedding away and everybody gets incredibly funny and creative and you say, I wonder why we're not on some kind of national talk show or something. And I think that the best state for making is when a person is unself-conscious but fully themselves. And that's the state of making that I seek. It's not about hand-wringing or a lot of anxiety. It's really a feeling about being part of a community and having dinner with your friends. I say about my work that I do large-scale temporary work, which I built on site from material that I gather somewhere nearby. And one of the unique qualities of the work is that there's no studio doors to close and no place to hide. The work is conducted in full public view, and for some artists that might be consternating, but I found a way to think of it as a cultural exchange, one of which the people and the energy of that place is actually folded back into the sculpture itself. And when I'm on site, I like representing making in a positive way. I like interceding for the arts. I like demystifying the process. But mainly, I like reminding people that artists are just normal people who are looking for their rightful place in the world of work. So I would like to show you a few slides, providing I can, let's see here. I wanted to show you a few slides of my house in North Carolina. You know, it's an eco house. It's got the smallest footprint in the world. All the materials are recycled. Everything has been taken from another building. These stones I dug in the backyard. And so I know that the bottom of this wall is not quite as good as the top, but I was just getting going. And I always sequence the stones that I have, just like I sequence sticks. And so all the good stones are on the inside of the building, and all the bad stones are on the outside. I threw out the whole house. I've used cedar that I collected in my woods and split it out kind of in a southwestern style, and this is a no painting house. This is my first stick woodshed, and when I was clearing my yard, I cut all the sticks and made good use out of them. And so it was kind of finding your sticks in place that started in this shed and has been spread out throughout the United States as I go to each ditch bank or around the beltline of cities and find how urbanization has taken all the trees and left only the small sticks that are about to be taken for the new box store. This was my first rock monument. I knew that no one was going to build one to me, so I just built one to myself. And it's a laid up stone monument, and it's got no mortar in it. And I've wanted to show you this because my neighbors have been an endless source of inspiration, and they're always telling me when their children go to college, you know, they're going to do something really good finally. And so I've got a lot of neighbors, and I put them out there. It's called Waiting It Out in Maple. I wanted to show you some materials shots, and this is a maple that was sitting outside my studio, and it takes about a tractor trailer load to make a fairly credible piece. A lot of times in the pictures I'm going to show you, it was going to seem like we've got these super long sticks, but actually most of the sticks are in the 6-foot variety, and your eye is actually making the jump. My friend Scott, we're bringing these sticks into a gallery. It's always an addition-subtraction problem. And this was at the Heron School of Art over in Indianapolis, and the city was clearing a new golf course, and so we were able to capitalize on the place just before the bulldozers arrived with a big pile of sticks to work with. I wanted to show you a piece from start to finish. This is a willow grove on a willow farm in Ireland, and actually before the Lowe's and Home Depot, you know, people grew willows for various uses around the house, including wrapping tops of radishes and putting walls together and all kinds of fencing and so forth. So this is a remnant of that time when we grew willow, and if you cut the stool, you get twice as many sticks. So rather than being degrading the environment, the willow is a really great thing to reproduce itself. And here we have the same problem here at Purdue. We had to go get our material and bring it over to our site. You can see those really long sticks that guy's holding up there, and those are our basic structural pieces. And this is at Tala Community Arts Center. You know, Ireland has more than leprechauns. It has some amount of crime. They were afraid that if I worked out on the street, then in fact somebody would tear the piece down. I was afraid that no one would see it, so I decided that I would make my own version of this vernacular architecture and the Irish round tower that is in and around Dublin. These monks in the 8th to the 9th century built these enigmatic towers, and so this was my version of it. It's about 42 feet tall, and there's a tree on the interior of it, and then that tree is what supports it, and then the living limbs of the tree are actually on the outside. And this was 2 years later, just before the piece came down, so you can see it has its original limbs. The tree was not in good shape to begin with, but I'd like to show you start to finish a piece at Cornell University, and here I'm gathering sticks in a maple grove. That we have the hauling of getting those things over to school. I wanted to build a companion piece for each one of these locust trees. There are 7 trees. I thought I'll build something that interacts with each of the trunks. I always make a thumbnail sketch. I did the same thing here. It's something that I read into, so if there's a coffee stain on that paper, it might get translated into some kind of stick thing. I mark out the piece on the ground, and we did the same thing over on the piece here for Sidewinder. We got a good footprint. We used hoses and electrical cords to figure out how the piece should look. In this case, they're allowing me to drill into their concrete because they were going to replace this area a little bit. So you can see my basic structural uprights go into these holes. Once we get our uprights in, we take and set a scaffolding around the whole thing, and then we pull the shape we want. Tie that shape back to the scaffolding, and as we work on it structurally, then we can cut the piece loose and it holds itself in place. This is a little more elaborate scaffolding than we used here. These are around the 24-foot high variety of towers, and this is the day of our opening. I wanted to show you how I work. This is a piece at the Savannah College of Art and Design. This was a building that was given to the college. It was the old county jail, and led me to think about making a lot of escape hatches or flying carpet or something. And they'd taken the roof off, and so you could look through the windows and see the sky into the interior. The piece is about 32 feet tall. It's called Cell Division. And the way I really work is that I start working structurally first. And so in this case, I've woven lots of sticks into the jail bars, and I start making this scrim that will hold the piece together. In other words, I'm going to make a canvas, and then I'm going to draw on it. I'm starting these circularities now that I've got the piece laid out and it's strong enough to take. Now that's kind of applique. I'll put sticks on where I think they really look good. It's kind of an aesthetic phase or a layer. And finally, there's the cosmetics, and that's what we've been doing on the Sidewinder over here yesterday. We were going around and doing fix-up. And basically that means erasing, and what we do is take tiny little sticks that don't even count for anything and hide things we don't like. And so in this case, you can see we don't have any cut ends or anything that would keep your eye from, would interrupt your eye from moving around the piece. I wanted to talk about my work in terms of temporary because I don't do any permanent work. This was a pink and white dogwood. I bent the limbs down a little bit at a time and wove over it. You could drive down the street and see the construction of it and wonder what the hell we were doing. I knew from an arborist that we had to have this thing off in 3 months, so this is its leafy phase, and then finally we're just about to pull it behind a car to the city dump. That picture I don't have, but this was at Swarthmore College, still talking about, you know, doing temporary work. This tree was slated to come down 2 years hence, and so I was allowed to use it. The great thing is that it had no limbs on one side and all the limbs on the other, so that allowed me to have this stacking thing so that you had this strong, dramatic vertical, and then you had this kind of stack form beside it. And this is its winter configuration. And then finally, some very dramatic takedown pieces, pictures, and this is 2 years later. So you see, it did survive and did survive the Philadelphia winter. This is a piece in Denmark in Krakemarken, which is a nature park, and you're supposed to use materials from the park in order to build your sculpture. When I saw all the other artists at this conference kind of cogitating about what they were going to make, I realized that when man thinks of nature, he seeks his own reflection. And so this is, the sculpture is seeking his own reflection in this little lake. You could crawl up in his insides and look out the window, look out his face. And then it had a great possibility. In the winter, this whole area flooded, leaving kind of this big mythic figure. The thing is about 33 feet long and about 16 feet tall. And then this is the hero fallen 2 years later, probably the best of the sculpture there, this imprint. This, you know, all of the North Carolina potters make face jugs. The Romans made face jugs. This was my attempt at making face jugs at the Frederick Meyer Gardens. But unfortunately, even though we did a good setback from the roof, 4 years later, the snow came tearing down the roof and left these poor things screaming. This is a particular effort. This was at the Clemson Botanic Gardens. It was after Vermonte's Tempietto, and we actually planted living, bare-rooted maples into this piece when we worked on it. And so this was 5 years later, and then 7 years later, so that you can see that there was a little remembrance of, or a talisman of what had actually existed prior to. I wanted to talk about my work in terms of drawing, and this is in Sheboygan, Wisconsin at the Kohler, and this is you know, I like this piece about as good as any because it's red dogwood and maple, and willow, and these pieces are woven into the track or the beams above the light tracks, and you can just touch them and they barely move. But I love the drawing quality, and everything that you do with a pencil, you do that very same thing with sticks. In other words, all the drawing conventions of hatch marks and diagonaling and using really small sticks to kind of blend in with the universe out there. You have to do the same thing with sticks. And sticks are tapered, and so when you strike a piece of paper with your pencil, you tend to hit it with one weight and finish off with another. In other words, lots of drawing is tapered lines, and it just so happens that stick fits the bill. And so the reason the surfaces seem to move is because you're having a whole series of these tapered lines that you can employ to your best advantage. This was a kind of skywriting. This is in Ireland, in Denmark along the North Sea. I just gathered on one side of the road, brought it over, and set some scaffolding and worked into the trees there. This was some big city calligraphy. This was at the World Trade Center. You know, if you've ever dealt with the Port Authority, they said, you know, you can use sticks in this building as long as they don't touch the walls, the floor, the ceiling. So I saw the electricians were using wooden ladders, and so I went to Putnam Ladder Company, borrowed some ladders, and was able to build a work there and fill the bill. One of the things is working on site allows you to adjust the scale, which is a really critical part and one of the great advantages of working stick by stick and line by line. Because in this case, I just went and got more ladders. It's a 10,000 square foot lobby. You know, 2 or 3 sticks in there was not going to do it. So, you know, adjusting the scale is a big plus. This was at the Phillips collection. It's 3 floors of sticks. That's about 16 feet wide, that little stick thing. I used a platform lift to build it. I'm outside the building looking down through the oculus above, and this kind of blending of these kind of smaller drawn lines with the kind of an architectural line of the building. And you know, I'm used to working even in tight situations where I would have to work with the ongoing activity of the space. In other words, people continue to use the stairway, and we could hear their confessions on the way up and down. What is this thing? This was at the American Craft Museum before their new building, and there again you can see how I've played off of the drawn line and the architecture itself. You know, I did mention that in fact there are no doors to close and no place to hide, and this is a normal day at the office. This was on the campus of the University of Michigan on the Diag. You know, the interesting thing is that there's 3 weeks of drama. In other words, it looks like hell the first day you're throwing the sticks out, and the same people that are calling the police that day are inviting you to dinner the last day. I'd say the more interesting thing is that people start living vicariously through you and the people that are working with you. And so sometimes as you ease up to the very end, they're afraid you're going to ruin it. They didn't like it. They really start liking it. They like it a lot. They come up and say, "Don't you think we've done enough?" And so, you know, you know, part of being public. This was an impromptu opening over it in New Harmony. When we took the scaffold back, people just came out of the woodwork. They dropped the barber's towel from around them and just came out to see what we were doing. And here again, people some kids in Ireland came to visit this big piece that I was making. And you know, the public informs you about your work. And you think you know about it and they tell you more. I mean, here we are back in childhood where kids know everything about sticks. They're a tool, a weapon, a piece of a wall, a magic wand, drumsticks. And people remember those childhood days. And in fact, I believe that we are kind of playing out a shadow life of our hunting and gathering selves in our childhood moments. So everybody had that feeling about playing with sticks, and so one of the big feelings that people bring to these kinds of sculptures is reminiscence about their own childhood play, or about a bird nest they've seen, or a bird about some kind of indigenous tribe that they visited or they've read about. Or sometimes it's just the feeling that for a minute you could step back into the Garden of Eden, step through the threshold, across the curtain without being encumbered with your worldly possession, and you could just be an animal for the day. I wanted to talk a little bit about using volunteers. If I've done one good thing, it was my willingness and ability to partner with organizations and use their leverage and the goodwill that they have to help organize the various things that are necessary to pull this off. And one of those things is labor. At a certain point, people said, we want to help you. Could we help you? How about if our volunteers helped you? And this is a piece in France, and I'd had too many glasses of Bordeaux, and so I thought, well, I will build some Bordeaux bottles. And it turns out that there is a kind of a saying in France called sortie de cave, and that means free at last. When the bottles themselves have been in the cellar so long and you let them out, then the bottles themselves are free to drink, and that's why you see them dumped onto the street outside. But what I really wanted to show you is that, I have a lot of help. And here we had I don't know, maybe 40 students in our class, and then some other people from outside, and professors and so forth came to help. In this case, this group of people was from a farm cooperative. They decided to come over and help us as well, pick the leaves off. There's an electrician here, a retired engineer from Africa, a plumber from down the street, several students. So we just really have gotten a lot of help over the years, I have, and it's really fun. This was the final minutes of this piece, and I just had a couple more pictures. This was at Middlebury College, where the students were helping me take the leaves off, and this was our starting point for getting ready with this. This was the final work, people out enjoying it. This thing is still up, and it's been there for about 4 years, even though the snow is quite deep. We developed a form that could really handle that snow, and these were the people that helped me build it. So I've just had lots of good help. I wanted to talk about my work in 3 different ways, very briefly. The first thing that I've done is to work with architecture, one kind of piece that I've made, and this was at the De Cordova and Lincoln, Mass., a way of suggesting a reciprocity between sculpture and architecture. And so they wouldn't let me get up on that roof that easily because they were afraid I'd dislodge the tiles. I built a mock-up on the ground, picked the thing up with a crane and put it up on the building. The only trouble was that the drawing quality of it was not that good. And so I decided I'd have to go up and reinvest the surface up there. So I got in a bucket truck and they moved me around. The piece is about 70 feet tall, so it's what you'll do for sculpture. And often when you're in a bucket truck, you're really frustrated. Finally, you just say, would you mind holding my belt? And you just can't help it. You just climb right out over the rail and start working. And so you can see that I did, in fact, put some heavier lines in there. This is the Floridian home being attacked by insects. And it's a Hollywood Cultural Arts Center. And, just an attempt to make different kinds of things that interface with architecture. This is in Manchester, England. And to try to put a kind of more rollicking garden gate feeling on the front of this, of the art museum. And this was in LA on Melrose Avenue. Max Azria asked me to When I do something with the front of their store, they didn't know exactly what I was going to do, and I'm hoping they were not sorry, but I decided to cover it with paisley cloth, and so produced this work. The second thing I've done is to work with trees, and using trees as a matrix on which to work. This was a tree, an oak tree in Japan. It was planted 400 years ago when this little Shinto shrine was built where I was allowed to stay. This is made of reeds and so forth. And so in Japan, sometimes a sacred tree at a temple has a rice rope around it to sanctify it. And so this was called holy rope, excuse me. And these kids came to visit me. So you can see I've used the verge and used all the bamboo and so forth too to help hold the piece up. This was in England in a Lalandia hedge, and even though it looks like a solid bank of trees, what it is if you stick your head in there, there's these huge cathedral-like spaces in the trees themselves. So this is a hallway that goes in, and then I developed these big kind of chambers in there and skylights for them. So it was a bit like a warren. You could walk in there. It was about 125 feet long of sticks. And this was a piece at Birmingham Museum of Art, and you read up the piece. The piece is about 50 feet tall. I considered it a roller coaster for squirrels, and have taken the limbs from two different trees, brought them together and wove over them. So it was really an interesting piece and went through several serious hurricanes. The other thing I've done is barred the overtones of trees and to set a mood. And this was back down in Savannah. This, be it ever so humble, it was set in underneath this live oak tree, and you could see these big source limbs above it, and then it dropped all this moss and stuff down on the top of the piece. This was a piece in Hawaii, and it played off of this monkey pod tree and the trunk system that the monkey pod tree had, and you can see how the thing kind of rolls up into the lower limbs of this big tree. And the piece at New Harmony, which is one of my favorite, where I was able to capitalize on a hornbeam hedge that had nothing underneath it and this big head of hair above it to build a kind of cliff dwelling feeling thing. And then this was its winter configuration, which was equally nice with all this huge verticality above it. And a piece in North Carolina called Trailheads, where each one of these heads basically takes over the crown of a tree and is interwoven with just one single tree. And so that was a really nice piece. And when I took it down, the mothers that had the kids that were in the neighborhoods around there came over and accosted me, and they said, "We're going to tell the artist that you're tearing this down." And I said, "They're making me do it." So we had it for about 2 years, and then it had to come down. The third thing I've done is I've had to make independent pieces because there's no trees to work in, there's no architecture to blend onto. And this was in England, and in an area where there was a lot of standing stones and Neolithic graves, and so this was in that manner. This was a new piece down in Rock Hill, South Carolina, in front of the Performing Arts Center called Ain't Misbehavin'. It's got 5 big heads that look different directions, so you can only see 4 at a time. This piece was at the Morris Arboretum, just came down. You know, it started out as a snail shell from my garden. It went to layer cake, and then it became a 14th century Japanese hairstyle. And then finally, it was the summer palace of Dr. Zhivago. This was at Bowdoin College, and it's called Simple Pleasures, and learning to take a group of objects and hook them together for the combined strength in order to hold up against snow, climbing, and other eventualities. But sometimes I have to build work inside that stands on its own, and this is based on kind of stick tripod kind of deal. It's called Sleepwalking, and it's about 27 feet high. It's in Brussels. And a piece up in Tacoma, Washington at the New Museum of Glass for their opening show, and using the reflective power of this pool to extend the image and fill that kind of huge space. This is a new work that I have in North Carolina as a private commission. And one thing I like about it, this just, you know, I just remind you there are no strings in this thing. There are no wires. This thing holds itself together through just sheer entanglement. But what I really wanted to show you, the last 2-3 slides is how many people will come to see a sculpture burned. And the Scots, you know, they're dramatic, and so they decided a year before the sculpture was built that they were going to burn it down at the end, and so the whole town, in fact, the entire county came to see it, just set on fire. This was the sculpture itself, built after Callanish standing stones, and then a scale picture to show you about the size of these things. And then, of course, the ultimate moment in which the fiery dancers were out there. But to add insult to injury, the dancers cooked their breakfast on my sculpture the next morning. Thank you very much. If we have time for questions, we're going to do some questions. We don't have to. They had a microphone that, is this one that's going to? You can always ask the people that help me. They know everything.
Just wanted to ask, how do you feel when you have to burn down your work? Like, I know you take a lot of effort in it, and it takes like a week or I don't know how many hours, but I've seen you guys out there, and it took you guys a long time. So how do you feel like your time and effort in this piece is just getting burnt down? I don't know.
Well, you know, as a context, we all do temporary work. I mean, doctors see patients, it's a one-time deal. You know, we're all doing temporary work. And so, you know, I always think that art history ought to take care of itself, and artists ought to do what they want to do. And if you get lots of opportunities to work, as I have, in a lot of non-traditional art spaces, the only way I'm able to work there is you've got to give the space back. And so it's been a worthy trade-off. You know, I'm very interested in process. I'm very interested in the community building aspect of getting up with a group of people and just working and using the sculpture as an excuse in some ways to have a really good time and to build something that's interesting to everyone.
Is it on? All right, 2 questions for you. 1, how long have you been doing this? And 2, have you worked in economically depressed areas, and has the artwork had an effect on the residents to perceive what they can do about their situation differently?
Well, I started in the early '80s, so that's the length of my career. You know, I don't really know how to answer whether one particular artwork can have an effect. I do know that what I try for is to reach everybody, whether it's the person who's painting pictures in the house, or whether it's the painter that's working on the outside of the house, or, you know, I feel like these works are available, and they're just different starting points in the work for different people. You see different things, you have different associations. Sometimes it reaches the level of thinking, oh, this is about drawing and form and so forth. But, you know, I don't know. I think my obligation is not to save people, but to make things that are incredibly exciting, that make people want to run over there and take a look. And to the degree that that provides uplift, I'm really glad.
Hi. Okay. I'm wondering, how many projects do you take on a year, and how much do you make annually as an artist?
Well,
I'm just curious.
Well, I do about 10 projects a year. I work somewhere every month. And, you know, in a way, in terms of just plain getting the work done, you know how lazy you can be if you have plenty of time? Well, this is kind of a forced feed. You have to produce. And so, in a way, that's meant that I've produced an enormous amount of work. In terms of charging, I charge everybody the same amount. Currently, I'm charging $15,000 plus my expenses. And so that sets the mark at a place where lots of people can afford me. And I can come, you know, temporary work is the problem. If you were doing permanent work and it lasted, you might make $100,000. But, you know, I feel like I want to be every man. I don't necessarily want to appeal to one particular segment of collectors. I really think art belongs to everybody, and that the real purpose of art is to excite the imagination. So I'm really happy with what I do and the way that I proceed.
Hi. I was just wondering, it seems like each of these projects have so much entailed in them, from concept to design to construction and collaboration with community groups. So how long is one of these projects from start to finish, from just the beginning of an idea to the completion?
Well, generally what happens is people contact me more and more just strictly on the web. And they'll email me and they'll say, could you send us some information? A lot of that, maybe we get 100, I don't know, not 100 a month, maybe we get 30 people ask us a month. Maybe 10 of those might be possible prospects. Maybe one of those really pans out that they can get the funding and they really want to do it and we have time to do it. So then I'll make a site visit. And on the site visit, I look around. I've kind of got a method to my madness. In a site visit, I try to make word associations with my site. I try to remember how I feel. When I look at a site, I make thumbnail sketches. I listen to the people that are the principals, you know, that have a lot of vested interest in the site. And then generally, we try to work out all the logistics of how we'll gather, where the piece will be. And then when I come back, then I actually decide what to do. When we see who's really going to help me and where the material's really going to come from, then I make my final decision. I feel like I'm carrying a little bit of a reservoir of ideas around, and like a novelist might have conventions, like I like to have doors and windows on some things, but you know, I try to be really fluid, and a lot of the actual work is very reactive. So it's ad-libbing most of the time, and that seems to work out really well. Yeah. It takes 3 weeks to build something. We're on site for 3 weeks. So, well, I really appreciate it. All right.